Okay, so this is video number 2. I just went for a run on some steep hills around my house here in St. Thomas, in the U.S. Virgin Islands where I live. Let's see if I can show that to you. If not, I'll just cut it right out. Yep, there's the ocean and the water. Um, U.S. Virgin Islands in the Caribbean. Went for a run, I took a shower. Later, I'll be uh, playing some music, practicing for a show with a good friend of mine in my band. Um, and then I'll go to work. So why do I do these things? I do these things. Uh, I had an agenda in telling you about my very mundane life here. I do these things because I'm trying to cultivate joyful affects, and that brings us to Spinoza. That's a Spinozan concept, a Spinozan phrase. So Spinoza, a lot of people probably already know this, but just to give a little historical background, Spinoza is one of the primary post-Cartesians, which means he came after Descartes. Him and Leibniz were two of the primary successors to Descartes. So Descartes, sort of the founder of modern philosophy, generally considered the founder of modern philosophy, and his probably most lasting primary contribution to philosophy is the mind-body dualism, which is it's a absolute incommensurability between the two substances of mind and body, and of mind and world. And so what Spinoza did a lot of things, but one of the primary things he did in relation to the Cartesian dualism, and he was very influenced by Descartes, but he reintegrated mind and body in a univocity of being, which it's univocal. And so, and by doing that, he showed that that body and the affects, the bodily feelings, are intimately intertwined with the mind, with thoughts, and that they are absolutely correlated in what he calls parallelism. Actually, I'm not sure if he calls it parallelism, but someone does. Deleuze certainly does. Deleuze. So Spinoza, and then Hegel was deeply influenced by Spinoza. He said that you're either a Spinozist or not a philosopher at all. And Schelling also was very deeply influenced by Spinoza, even though Schelling and Hegel were initially friends. I mean, they were roommates in college, and Hegel, of course, was initially Hegel was initially Schelling's early follower and supporter, and then he pretty much definitively surpassed him with the phenomenology of spirit. But then later in his life, in his 60s, Schelling gave some lectures where he was very critical of Hegel, but also he, I think, extended and formed a primary complement to the Hegelian dialectic in his conception of potencies. So pretty much all of the great philosophers, especially in the continental tradition, were deeply influenced by Spinoza. And of course, Deleuze is one of his trinity of philosophers that he was influenced by. The other two are Nietzsche and Bergson. And so I first read Spinoza after I had already read Deleuze, knowing that Deleuze was deeply influenced by Spinoza. So I hadn't read any of the two books that Deleuze wrote about Spinoza, which is the shorter one is, well, the first one is one of his two dissertations, along with Difference and Repetition, was also published in 1968. is expressionism in philosophy, which is primarily about Spinoza and also partially about Leibniz and the Neoplatonists to some extent. And then also, I think it was in 1970, he published a shorter book called Spinoza Practical Philosophy, which is, if you're into Spinoza, that's a great introduction to Deleuze's work. It's relatively accessible, if you can call any of Deleuze's work accessible. So Spinoza himself is pretty accessible. When I first read him, I was sort of struck by how straightforward and simple his writing was. So Spinoza was one of the first, or probably the first modern philosopher to really take affect seriously, the bodily feelings, bodily emotions, and feelings that aren't necessarily emotions, but the things that move the body, that are felt rather than thought. But his construction of affect is very dualistic, and I was struck by that because of his primary influence on Deleuze, who is one of his primary negative contributions, at least, is to push against the dualism of the dialectic. And so, but Spinoza made affect, he rendered affect thinkable for modern philosophy, and all of the, many of the philosophers that came after him who were influenced by him, refined and expanded and extrapolated from his theory of affects, bodily affections. And so one of the things that's the most fascinating to me about Spinoza is, so on first reading, like I said, it seems pretty simple, pretty straightforward, but the more you engage with it and the more you think about it, there's this paradoxical, mysterious depth that keeps luring you into these obscure interstitial domains. What at first glance can seem simple and relatively straightforward becomes extremely generative and complex, which is why some of the most complex and difficult philosophers, the ones I've already mentioned especially, have continued to think about him for centuries. One of his most interesting concepts or sort of affective complexes, or conceptual affective complexes, because they're intimately intertwined, is that he rejects free will, which is very striking, because one tends to think of modern philosophy as asserting the free will of the human individual. But I think it's much more complex than that. So a lot of people, including colleagues that I highly respect, and for whom this is one of the very few areas of disagreement that I have with these colleagues, they interpret Spinoza's determinism as an absolute mechanistic determinism in which every concrete detail in reality is determined in advance. And the reason why Spinoza talks about this freedom of mind, what he calls freedom of mind, is because what we basically have to do is resign ourselves to our fate. It's amor fati, love of fate. And I think that this goes beyond paradox to being merely inconsistent. Because if every moment of existence is given in advance, down to the smallest particle, the smallest interaction, the smallest thought, the smallest affect, but especially the smallest thought, there's no freedom of choice, then what would it mean to try to cultivate a joyful attitude towards our fate? Because that choice of cultivating a joyful attitude would also be determined. So the majority of what Spinoza writes would be completely pointless because it's basically the majority of the ethics, which is what I'm describing, which is his magnum opus that was published after his death, um, is basically about how to cultivate joyful affects as in order to counteract sad affects. And so if everything is given in advance in a fixed block universe that proceeds mechanistically, so that the initial conditions completely and absolutely determine every moment, every concrete detail of every moment in the universe, then there's no real becoming, which, of course, is a central concept not only of Hegel and Schelling, but of Deleuze, becoming animal, etc., etc. So I think what Spinoza is after is something more profound than that. And he expresses it, he doesn't express it directly. I think he's feeling his way toward it because he's creating the language and the concepts to try to express this novel mode of thought that's somewhat, I think, difficult to understand, which is why even a lot of the most, brilliant philosophers I know, I think I disagree with them about this. And, I think my view on this subject has been really informed by Deleuze's reading of Spinoza in those two books I mentioned, and in all of his other books where he talks about Spinoza. And he talks about Spinoza a lot, possibly more than anyone else except for maybe Nietzsche and Bergson. But maybe Spinoza's the most. I'd have to go do an analysis of concordance or something like that. But that's my sense. The determinism that Spinoza discusses it's a determinism of affect. The will is determined, and the will is affect. So basically, my reading of what he's saying is that emotions happen to us. We can't choose which emotions to have. We can't choose whether to be angry or sad, or or joyful, or perplexed or bemused or bittersweet or whatever mixed emotions we might have. But we can choose how to express those emotions. And specifically, we can choose at which register, which order of becoming to express those emotions. So this is another area that's somewhat controversial, because I think a lot of even Spinoza scholars think that Spinoza doesn't believe that we have any freedom of choice. We only have it's almost like a Buddhist freedom of mind to just accept our fate, to try to be happy in relation to our fate. But in the Ethics, I think it's twice he uses the word choose in sort of these insignificant moments. But I think they're moments that betray or reveal that he believes that we have decisional freedom. We have the ability to choose. And so there are these moments where he's talking about his process of writing, and he's saying, I'm choosing to do it in this order or something to that effect. So he's not saying we as humans have decisional freedom, but he's saying I, Spinoza, writing this book, I'm choosing to do this. And so to me, if we're closely reading his text, that means that he is affirming that we have freedom of choice, but we don't have freedom of the will, because the will is how we feel, and the will is it can be, I envision it in sort of possibly a Bergsonian metaphor, as waves of affect that we can, and I live right here by the ocean, and it's actually a surf break right out there. So I don't surf, but I watch surfers every day, and we we can choose how we relate to these complex waves of affect, whether to ride them skillfully or to be tumbled by them in the surf and even drown. And so, and our choice is primarily concerned with at which order to express this affective will. So the affects, Spinoza affirms formal causes, but the formal causes he affirms are not the transcendent Platonic forms, because he thinks that everything is immanent. It's pure immanence, which was also very influential on Deleuze. But he thinks that God and the world are immanent. God and the world are two ways of describing the same immanent entity. It's this infinite univocity of being. And so the forms. So the forms are expressed as the affects, and so we encounter the forms as these affective potencies, as feelings, but also felt intimations. And so this word potency is largely derived. I mean, it's a Latin word which means it's from potens, potentia, potential, in potentia. It's potential, it's power. But it's potential and power. So, but it's also powers. And Schelling specifically, and the Neoplatonists, but Schelling specifically relates this idea of potencies, which is a translation of the Greek dynamism, he associates these potencies specifically in his late lecture on mythology with the gods of Hellenic polytheism. And Nietzsche and Deleuze both very complexly take up this correlation of the affectively encountered potencies correlated with the gods, in often ambiguous ways, but it's definitive. I mean, especially Deleuze, he's constantly evoking the gods, and it's very difficult to understand where he stands on this. And this is something that Schelling talks about, and this is kind of going beyond Spinoza for a moment. But Schelling's understanding of the gods is very similar, and Deleuze also evokes this, actually. It's very similar to Freud's later understanding of traumatic events, which aren't literal events. They're ontologically ambiguous. It doesn't really matter if those traumatic events occurred or not, because it's the imagined, remembered reality of those events that has the effect in one's later psychological development. And so for Schelling, the ontological status of the gods is not fixed. They're not these divine beings who reside in some transcendent domain up in Olympus, but they're also not merely metaphors for natural processes or poetic evocations of human archetypal situations. They're all of these things, but they exceed all of these things. Okay, so Spinoza doesn't really talk about gods, so let's leave that to the side. But he does talk about these affective formal causes which determine the will. So for Spinoza, the primary task of human life, in my reading, is to choose at which order to express the affective complexes that determine one's will. So in one of the primary examples that I use in my book that's forthcoming in hopefully in summer of 2022, being published by Routledge, which is called um, Integration and Difference, Constructing a Mythical Dialectic. And that term, mythical dialectic, is derived from Deleuze's Difference and Repetition, and it talks about all this. Most of this material that I'm talking about is discussed in the book. So one of the primary examples I use uh, for this concept that which is also present in Deleuze and also Jung, actually, but this idea that the affective will can be expressed on different orders of magnitude. So in Difference and Repetition, Deleuze says um, that, for instance, the founding of um, the French Republic was a differential repetition of the founding of the Roman Republic. Um, and so so one of the primary so I look at this in relation to um, you know, Derrida's feeling of lack, and Nietzsche's Derrida's relation to undecidability and liminality. That's, I think, affectively determined, but which doesn't undermine his philosophy at all. It's what ultimately drives his philosophy, and so Derrida and Nietzsche, Deleuze, pretty much every great philosopher is driven by some affective problem, profound problematic complex, and Deleuze specifically associates the ideas, his conception of ideas, the eidos, the formal causes, um, with problems. Their problems are the motive factors of becoming, because without problems, there's no impetus toward becoming, and everything is static. So, um, so for Deleuze, um, so of course Deleuze's most famous work probably is almost certainly is with Guattari and Anti-Oedipus. It's their most widely read work, and so it's a sustained argument against the Oedipal in relation to um, these sort of different phases of historical becoming, um, which are very interesting, but kind of beyond the scope of what we're doing today. I'm actually rereading Anti-Oedipus right now in preparation for writing my new project, so I'm going to restrain myself from talking about um, the section, what is it, Savages, Barbarians, and Civilized Men, which is extremely interesting. And I think, actually, if you've read Jean Gebser, I think there are a lot of correlations, and maybe I'll talk about this in a future video, but there are some profound correlations between Gebser's 5, he calls them structures and mutations of consciousness, and the basically four, I guess they're axiomatics or overcodings that Deleuze and Guattari talk about in Anti-Oedipus. But so my point in relation to Spinoza and the Oedipal is that Deleuze, in my reading, was driven to so profoundly critique the Oedipal, but also to show with Guattari how the Oedipal operates to construct the modern capitalist socius, the sort of that triangulation is intimately related to the dialectic and to capitalism and schizophrenia, and but I think the reason why Deleuze was drawn toward critiquing the Oedipal is because if you read his biography, the biography by Francois Dassé, it's a dual biography of Deleuze and Guattari. Deleuze had a markedly Oedipal relationship with his father. So, first of all, so he says in the L'Abécédaire interview, the ABCs of Gilles Deleuze, that his father was very good, very kind, very benevolent. I think that's an almost direct quote. But his father was also a right-wing anti-Semite, which of course is directly opposite to Deleuze's political views. He's extremely progressive, and his, his two of his three favorite philosophers, Spinoza and Bergson, were both Jewish, which he even says somewhere that he thinks that the fact that Spinoza was Jewish has something to do with why he was a great philosopher. I'm slightly more than half Jewish, by the way. I just should throw that in there. So I have some authority to talk about this. And Nietzsche, of course, struggled with anti-Semitism and inspired the Nazis, but he also inspired, existentialism, depth psychology, and postmodernism. So he really deeply inspired Jewish thinkers like Freud, Derrida, and I think that he ultimately rejected anti-Semitism, and Deleuze does too. I mean, it's Nietzsche was complicated and he was going insane. So it's really hard to say what he ultimately believed, but he said a lot of really brilliant things and a lot of really crazy things, honestly. But I think that that's why Deleuze was so drawn. Yeah, also, the two books that Deleuze wrote about novelists, the one he wrote by himself is on Proust, who is Jewish, and the one he wrote with Guattari is on Kafka, who is Jewish. And even in Kafka, he talks about, really complexly about Kafka's relationship to his father, and how he was, sort of pushing. It's almost like an Oedipal accelerationism. And in an interview, it's really interesting. He says that Guattari is more in favor of the acceleration of not only capitalism and schizophrenia, but also the Oedipal. That he wants to accelerate those, to push them to their limit. And Deleuze, I think, is somewhat more ambivalent about that accelerationism. And so I think that this movement of accelerationism that has taken some very strange turns into some right-wing fascistic directions with Nick Land and etc. I think that's first of all, I think Deleuze and Guattari would strongly denounce that sort of thinking. And I just don't think, I've read some Nick Land, and I just don't think he's a very good writer. I think he's trying to write like Deleuze and Guattari, and he's just not as good as them, and he's just trying to be as transgressive as possible. And it's actually kind of sad, because a lot of young thinkers, in their teens and 20s, who are getting really into this extremely difficult theory, are sort of latching onto Nick Land as this extremely transgressive figure, and I wish they wouldn't. I wish they wouldn't, because he's awful. He's racist, and he's in favor of fascism, and I think they should just stay far away from him. And he's on Twitter, and a lot of people are getting a lot of their philosophical knowledge from Twitter, and that gives you a very skewed view of the actual philosophical landscape, because Twitter is not real life. It's not the real world. And popularity as a philosopher on Twitter, and I'm somebody who's on Twitter a lot, and I've posted a lot on there, but it does not equate to being a successful philosopher in the real world. It does not equate to selling a lot of philosophy books or being cited by a lot of philosophers. I mean, there are some very successful philosophers who are also very successful on Twitter. But it's actually really remarkable. This is sort of a digression about Twitter, because there's a lot of philosophy that occurs on there, and it's a really interesting phenomenon that's only been around for about 15 years. That's actually been pretty formative in my philosophical development. First of all, I have to say, I've met a lot of really brilliant colleagues on Twitter, made a lot of really great connections, and I've also it can be a really great place for doing research, for exchanging ideas and learning about new works, new articles, new twists on concepts that you hadn't considered. So a lot of the ideas that I've pursued, I've encountered first in relation to people on Twitter. I've become to feel really ambivalent about Twitter and about social media in general in the last few years, especially since I watched that documentary, The Social Dilemma. And I think a lot of people are right there with me. Primarily because it's a large corporation and then they've been using this algorithm since I think 2015 or something like that. So before they instituted the algorithm, you were just getting what people posted in the order that they posted it, which I think was a better approach. And now they're using this algorithm in the way Facebook does, I think probably even more nefariously, to manipulate us and to keep us addicted. And they're just trying to maximize our usage of the app in order to sell our content and our presence on the app to advertisers, and also to sell our data, our metadata. And so they keep us addicted with no regard for how it makes us feel. And for me, Twitter is really like a drug, and I've heard people comparing it to cigarettes, and how the cigarette companies were telling everyone for years and years and years that, oh, no, it's not harmful, it's not addictive, and then of course we found out that it's extremely harmful and extremely addictive. And some people still smoke even with that knowledge, and I still go on Twitter with that knowledge, but I go on less than I used to, and the reason I do that is because I'm trying to cultivate joyful affects in my life. And so sometimes Twitter can be extremely joyful. If you have a good tweet that does numbers, as a colleague of mine said, that can be a rush. It can be a high. It can be a great feeling. But then whether your tweets aren't as good for a while, or people just aren't going on as much, or people the quality of the time changes, and people just aren't as open to ideas, or whether something in the algorithm is manipulating who sees the different content that's going on the site. Excuse me. So I think that that's something that really needs to be addressed, and I think it needs to be regulated. And I think that we should probably, if not turn these social media sites into public utilities, at least regulate them much more highly, and regulate their use of algorithms which manipulate us on a very subliminal, unconscious level. Okay, so Spinoza. We're talking about Spinoza and philosophy. This is philosophy. We're doing philosophy of social media today, philosophy of technology. How far? Oh, we're 35 minutes in. Okay, I should probably wrap up soon. So anyway, Deleuze, markedly Oedipal relationship with his father. So during World War II, his parents. So I don't really know much about his relationship with his mother, because there's just not that much information in the two biographies about him. The other one by Frida Beckman, about his relationship with his mother. But his relationship with his father was complex, and so it seems really clear that Deleuze transferred that Oedipal relationship with his father to Jean Hippolyte, who was his esteemed teacher, who was the translator of the Phenomenology of Spirit, Hegel's first great work, um, in France, and was probably the eminent Hegelian in the mid 20th centuries in France. And he was deeply influential on Deleuze. Deleuze dedicated his first book, Empiricism and Subjectivity, on Hume in 1953 to Hippolyte. And Hippolyte was serving as one of Deleuze's dissertation directors, and it was for Difference and Repetition. And of course, they disagreed about Hegel, because Deleuze was extremely critical of Hegel, and maybe I'll discuss that in a later video. I discussed that at length in Integration and Difference. But Hippolyte was a Hegelian who took Hegel in some really interesting directions. In what's his book? Logic and Existence, I think, or the Logic. Yeah, I think that's it. Logic of Existence. Anyway, and so he had this really strong sort of almost father-son relationship with Hippolyte, very similar to what Jung and Freud had. And of course, Jung and Freud had their break. And Hippolyte became, Deleuze became very critical of Hegel and sort of implicitly of Hippolyte. And so they drifted apart. And then Hippolyte, also Nietzsche and Wagner have this similar father-son dialectic with a break. And Hippolyte eventually started spreading, supposedly slanderous rumors about Deleuze's sexuality, which, I don't think, Deleuze didn't care about the content of the rumors. He was, he's in favor of 1,000 sexes. He's the farthest from asserting sort of a heteronormative, way of thinking. But it hurt him that Hippolyte was sort of trying to say bad things about him behind his back. And in another context, someone called him a slur, against basically being homosexual, because even that he was married to a woman. But I think Deleuze is, as much as any other philosopher, has problematized this sort of binary sexuality. It's ridiculous. But because Deleuze had long fingernails and longish hair, and perhaps was sort of had some supposedly feminine performative aspects in his gestures. Someone called him this slur, and he said yes, and so, which I just think is brilliant. He didn't try to argue with it. He just cut to the heart of it and said, "Who cares?" And it's the same thing with the TERFs, with the trans exclusionary radical feminists these days. Which unfortunately, so there's Kathleen Stock, who's the sort of the top philosopher who's against trans people. And what a thing to focus on in your career, to focus on how trans people shouldn't be allowed in women's bathrooms. I mean, if you actually know any trans people, you know that that's just absurd and ridiculous. That who cares? Just let people make their own choices about how they want to perform their sexuality, and their gender, perform their gender. And then, of course, J.K. Rowling, what a strange thing. I mean, she wrote these great, Harry Potter books, that, I think they're the most, they've sold the most copies of any books other than the Bible. I mean, they're great books. I read them to my son. And whole generations have really deeply enjoyed these books. But she's somehow decided now post Potter, she's going to make her crusade, an anti-trans crusade, that uh, that um, only only people who are born biologically women, or however you, I mean, even defining that is very problematic, of course, but uh, that only they should be allowed to call themselves women. And I just think that's just an absurd thing to spend your time on. I mean, there's so many. I mean, that's not even. It's just not a problem. Just accept people as they are if it doesn't hurt you, and someone being trans doesn't hurt you. So that's my soapbox for today on that current social issue. So just to wrap up, I'm over the time that I meant to go here, but so the reason why Deleuze, I think, was able to so brilliantly and incisively critique the Oedipal, and also Hegel, is because he struggled with an Oedipal complex in relation to his father and in relation to Jean Hippolyte. And that's no indictment of Deleuze's critique of the Oedipal complex. I think he's right. And I think, in Zizek, Slavoj Zizek, he pointed out that the critique of the Oedipal complex in Anti-Oedipus well, this is what Zizek says, is that it's largely derived from Jung. And it's true, it's very close to C.G. Jung's critique of the Freudian Oedipal complex. And they discuss Jung in that text, and they in A Thousand Plateaus they say that Jung is in any event profounder than Freud, although they critique Jung. Deleuze, in his text With and Without Guattari, refers to Jung both critically and affirmatively in at least 9 separate texts, and probably others. It refers to Jung by name, or his concepts like the archetypes, synchronicity, individuation, etc. Deleuze was very influenced by Gilbert Simondon and Gaston Bachelard, who were both very influenced by Jung. So I'd like to write a book. Maybe after I'm working on this next book, but maybe after that book, I'll write a book about Jung's influence on French philosophy. I think that would be really interesting. I might have to improve my French first to do that. But anyway, so Deleuze's critique of the Oedipal complex is motivated and made possible by his struggle with what he calls the suffocating secret of the Oedipal in what is grounding, I think, which was his 1954 to 55 or 55 to 56 seminar in relation to Kierkegaard, which is a really great seminar, which talks a lot about the gods and polytheism. I highly recommend it. But he calls it the suffocating secret of the Oedipal in relation to Kierkegaard and his father. And I think that I talk about this at length in my book, and I go into more detail. But so just to bring it back around to Spinoza, I think that the interpretation, I think this is Deleuze's interpretation of Spinoza, and it's my interpretation of Spinoza, is that we can't control how we feel, although we can cultivate certain affects by actively choosing how we express the affects that are coursing through us. So Deleuze expressed the Oedipal complex at its highest register. And this is an affective and conceptual complex that are intimately intertwined. He expressed it at its highest register rather than as a mere Oedipal drama expressed at its lowest, most unconscious register. just simply, um, and maybe he did express it at that lower register as a young man. He was, I'm sure he was probably angry at his father, as many of us are. I mean, I think very few people don't have some anger uh, toward their parents, um, but in order to overcome that edible quality with one's parents, you have to. It's necessary to reconcile with them, or at least with their imago, with their their imagined, um, affective, imaginal complex that's internal to one's psyche, that's projected out onto them, um, and that's archetypal. Um, and we could talk about Deleuze and Guattari's critique of the archetypes in another video, but I think ultimately they affirm something very close. Especially Deleuze affirms in many different registers, using many different words, quasi causes and ideas, and simulacra, um, potencies, um, problems, questions. Um, he affirms, and even he uses the word archetype affirmatively in like Proustian science. Um, so basically, what Spinoza is saying is that how we feel is determined, but we have the freedom to choose at which register, which order of becoming we express those affects. Um, and so, I mean, I could just keep going and going about this for hours, but I think I'll save that for later talks. So anyway, thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoyed it. Have a good day.